Hello and welcome to Run Testers. My name's Nick. I am joined by Kieran and Mike, and we are going to talk about running watches. So instead of just doing one massive best running watches video this year, we are basically going to do a video on each of the categories we normally have in that video. So today it's the best beginner running watches. We're also going to have one on the best value running watches, best mid-range, best high-end, best smartwatch. And that just means we have a little bit more time in each of these videos to go through what we think are the top options, give you the different options that might suit different runners in different ways without just kind of running through them really quickly, and you get a bit more information and the video is a bit shorter, so you don't have to watch 1 hour long video, which is sometimes not practical. It's just not practical. So today is the best beginner running watches. I think we've got 4 watches in this category we wanted to pick out, and with a beginner running watch we want to look at a few things. So obviously you've got to be pretty good value. You don't want to spend loads and loads of money on your first running watch. It's got to be accurate and reliable like all running watches need to be. Ideally it has some kind of features that help you out as a beginner runner, and we've also picked, I think, 1 or 2 watches that are just quite nice watches. So if you don't end up sticking with running, you have a watch that you might want to keep around anyway because it's just a nice watch. Anyway, let's dive into some of those watches now. The first one we want to talk about is a watch that came out, I don't know if it was the back end of last year or the start of this year, but it's the Garmin Forerunner 165. Mike, when did this watch come out?
I feel like in my head I was testing this early this year. But yeah, this is effectively the most affordable AMOLED Forerunner watch. Obviously there's been the Venue series, but this is, in terms of the Forerunner range, this is kind of Garmin giving a more affordable route into its watch range, or its running focused watch range, with a colour display. So that's really what the story was here with the 165, and really bringing kind of it's more entry level watch, more in line with kind of what we're seeing in kind of modern kind of smartwatches and sports watches.
Yeah, so Garmin brought AMOLED to more expensive Forerunners like the Forerunner 265, the 965, and the 165 is a cheap watch. Still not very, very cheap, but it's pretty good value. It's got all the kind of key running features you expect from Garmin. Some of the ones that are really good for beginners are things like suggested workouts. You can download training plans to the watch. You are going to get a lot of support on that front as well, and it'll give you a little bit of training node analysis, but it doesn't throw a huge amount of data at you, it's fair to say. Kieran, you've tested this watch as well, right?
Yeah, and I think I have. The good thing about this watch is one of those, I think, for a beginner, particularly your running might go one of 2 ways. You might run for a bit and hate it and decide you're never doing it again, but then you might sort of really get hooked on it, and a lot of people do, and then you want to run a watch that's going to give you a little bit of headroom to help you kind of grow into running before you maybe in a few years' time go and spend something on a watch that's more fully featured. But this watch, to me, it has enough features that it will cater for your running to develop over a few years. I think it's kind of does a lot of the basics really well as well, and no matter how much you're spending, you want pretty reliable heart rate, you want good GPS reliability, you want something that's light and comfortable with a decent battery life. Battery life's not as long on this watch, but it will probably cover you if you're running sort of 2 or 3 times a week, and take care of you. So that's what I like about this watch. It cut for a beginner. It kind of has your back if you're going to kind of grow and become a more regular runner.
Yeah, definitely. It's also a pretty nice looking watch with that AMOLED screen, so you can wear it a bit. It's not a triathlon watch. That's something to note if you're a beginner who does want to do multi-sport. Would say also, we're calling these beginner watches. The Forerunner 165 would be perfectly good for my running, even as someone who's very keen and runs all the time. Like, it would do everything I need, but there are some features of more expensive watches that might appeal to others. But yeah, so that's the Forerunner 165. I think in this category, the other really, really good kind of entry-level watch in the brand's range that doesn't have an AMOLED display but is a triathlon watch, has longer battery life, it's the Coros Pace 3, a watch that I think is one of the strongest candidates for me that I would buy if I was going to buy a running watch from scratch. Again, it's just a really good, tiny little lightweight watch, really good accurate tracking with dual band GPS in it, which you don't get on the Forerunner 165. Good battery life because it's got that slightly duller memory and pixel display, but in general just a pretty incredible watch all round, and one that I think we've all enjoyed testing, it's fair to say.
Yeah, I think, of all the watches we're probably going to talk about, this is probably one that I can recommend to most people. And I think, particularly if you are a runner, but also maybe you're doing other things outside of running, this is it really hits that sweet spot in terms of price, in terms of value, in terms of level of features. And I think in terms of the Coros range as well, it's one that really kind of stands out, and I think it's the watch where I think a lot of other kind of more established watch brands particularly will be looking at, because, in terms of what you're getting for how much you're paying for those features, things like dual frequency GPS, the fact that you're getting some navigation feature support there as well too at this price as well. And while it might not be the kind of fully featured kind of smartwatch that you might see it for a little bit more money, and may see I think particularly from a Garmin point of view, I think it will give enough for people, particularly getting a music player, you're getting notifications, things that I think will be enough for most people to have a good mix of a kind of running watch and a smartwatch experience. And I think crucially living up to kind of that kind of good battery life that we kind of all kind of have experienced with Coros watches, since it's kind of entered this space.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say, it's one of the, when you look at what you get on as you move up the chain in Coros, most of that is here on the Pace 3, which is great. You're getting a fully featured watch, and that one is definitely one that will grow with you. I kind of think of this one as sort of functional, not fancy in terms of the way it's built. It is a bit kind of plasticky. The materials are not that kind of premium. There are much sort of nicer looking watches on the wrist. The flip of that is that it's also really nice and lightweight, really easy to wear. So if you come into it, you're not used to wearing a watch all the time to do all that 24/7 tracking. I think this is one of the easier ones to wear outside of when you're not running as well.
Yeah, it is a nice little watch. I like the kind of look and feel of it, but it is much more plasticky, like you say, than even the Forerunner 165 is all plastic, but it probably has a nice design. It has better smart features in terms of music, and I think the Coros Pace 3 is one that really appeals to hardened runners as well. So even if you are a beginner, or a hardened runner, it's one that really appeals. But it's probably one that if you don't carry on running and doing a lot of sport, it might not be a watch you wear so much, whereas maybe the 165 has a bit more stickability as just a general watch as well. And that's definitely true of the third watch we've talked about for beginners, which is one that we haven't really talked about in the beginner category before, but holds a lot of appeal. I think this is probably the one I see on the wrist of most new runners I know these days, which is the Apple Watch. The Apple Watch Series 10 is the latest version, and obviously here you're getting a smartwatch, the Apple Watch, which has a whole load of appeal outside of your running. It's much smarter than sports watches with smart features. You've got a proper app store, really easy music, proper Apple Wallet, which is very handy. And now, while I think the native tracking is pretty good on the Apple Watch, what you're really getting that appeals to beginners here is access to the App Store and a whole load of apps that will devise training plans based on your kind of current fitness, your ability, your background, things like Runner, Cooper. There are loads of these apps now that are really good, and it just means they'll guide you through your first steps in the sport, whether you're training for a race or just running in general. Couch to 5K, another really good option. So I think that's what's really appeals to me about the Apple Watch for beginners, is that A, you can wear it even if you stop running almost immediately. It's just an Apple Watch, and B, it's those apps. I think they really a really good idea for beginners. Wouldn't you say that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we'd probably all agree in terms of offering a smartwatch experience. It's unrivaled, I think, and you look at it from an Android point of view as well too. No one's really got close to what Apple kind of offers from that point of view, and then you can see what it's offering. So from a native kind of running tracking point of view, I think it's getting better, and I think it is very kind of intuitive to use, but there's that breadth of apps, and actually genuinely very good quality running apps that really elevates what you can do with the Series 10. I think what has really stood out for me is that the big reason this exists, I think, and ultimately it being a bigger watch, is that we had the Ultra 2, and I think people liked having a bigger watch, but ultimately what I think Apple's done with the Series 10 is grown its kind of series watch, but not make it feel like a bigger watch. I don't think, or as hulkingly kind of big as the Ultra, and still giving you that kind of bigger kind of screen estate ultimately, but still kind of retaining that core feeling experience of using an Apple Watch. I think while it doesn't lacks things like kind of dual band GPS, which is obviously a key difference from this and the Ultra 2, I think it still performed very well. I think we've all kind of done tests where in race environments and other tests we've done in our review, which kind of shows it still kind of holds up pretty well. So the biggest thing for me is the battery life, but I think ultimately if you can deal with that, you can live with that kind of level of battery life that you're not getting over some other kind of dedicated sports watches, then I think there's a lot to like here. And as you said, Nick, it's from a beginner point of view, it's a very easy watch to get on with. It's
the banker, isn't it? I mean, this is the one that if you're not sure if you're going to become a full-time runner, you could buy this one and know that it's going to do everything else that you need it to do as a smartwatch in your life. It still has a life beyond your own kind of running career if that all takes a nosedive. I think also to speak to the battery life aspect as well, Mike, it's one of the things that I fixate on a lot in terms of sort of having long battery life. I hate charging stuff. The rapid charge on the Series 10 is actually, it's so quick that you whack it on for 5-10 minutes and it kind of fills the gap. So even though if you don't do that, this thing will run out quite quickly over a day or whatever. That it's very easy to top up and alleviate a lot of that battery life anxiety. And for the majority of people who are just starting out running, you're not going to need a watch that's going to take you into hours and hours and hours in a single stint. So that is also covered. Yeah. And I think what Apple, I guess one of the things they're quite we're always, as more serious runners rather than beginners, we're always a bit like, why haven't you added this? Why haven't you added that feature? When's this coming? And they're actually quite good at just layering on information when they've distilled it to a point where it's quite easy to understand and compute and not overcomplicated. And I think that also appeals. So a lot of their metrics that they add, they do it thinking about people who may not be that well acquainted with them. And I think that's a real positive from the Apple Watch as well as Nick said, all the third-party apps that make it kind of really encouraging and enticing. A really simple thing for a beginner might even just be doing enough running to close the Apple rings every day, and that's an addictive feature. Those motivational elements come to it as well, so I think that's a real positive.
Yeah, it's just a very good fitness tracker, like activity tracker, let alone running, I would say. Like, I do think closing the rings is one of the best activity tracking things out there. Cheaper models in the Apple range you could look at, like the Apple Watch Series 9 doesn't have quite as nice a design, but has all the same apps. It's still a very good looking watch, similar on battery life, accuracy, everything like that. Apple Watch SE 2 I've not tested, but I think you do lose a little bit on heart rate accuracy for one. So Apple Watch Series 10 is the one we've picked out here. Other little negative for runners is you don't really get a proper lap button, but which is annoying, which is why it's often better to do kind of guided workouts from an app which does the lap for you. But yeah, it's quite that is something that does become annoying at any level of running, I'd say. But anyway, last watch we're going to pick out here, which is probably the cheapest one we can think of for beginners. That is still a really good watch. It's now quite old. It's the Garmin Forerunner 55. Now, this was the entry-level Forerunner in Garmin's range. They've not updated it for a while now. Still a very reliable, small watch. Very good at tracking runs at a basic level. Does all the information, not even a basic level. It has loads of information on there. You can do workouts, suggested workouts, all that kind of stuff. It's probably not going to get a huge amount of updates going forward from Garmin in terms of software, but all the software you need is kind of already there. And usually you will see it in sales, well, I'd say probably mid £150, kind of maybe slightly below that if you get lucky. It's not dropping as much as I was hoping it was going to be. Like, I've been looking out for it. I was hoping it would get nearer £100, but hasn't yet. But it might do in time, and that's just a really good kind of budget option for beginners, I would say.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think I tested this back in 2021, I think. But I think, I still think it holds up now. I mean, obviously, we're getting to a point where Garmin's really rolling out the kind of AMOLEDs into its range, and we haven't really had a truly kind of budget version of what we're seeing in the other Forerunner watches. But I think in terms of, like you say, giving you the basics is definitely giving you a lot more than the basics. I think the main things you're probably missing out from the 165 AMOLED aside, probably some of the navigation support you're getting, a little bit more in terms of storage, which is going to give you a bit more room to have more in terms of software on there, and giving it that ability to be updated as well too. So if those things don't massively concern you, if you're happy with a pretty primitive kind of smartwatch experience, which you do get, I think a generally very good one here, 55, and it's definitely one that I absolutely still recommend. And there's not many watches that do sit at around that price range that I think you can say, actually, this is a good watch to buy.
I agree with all that. I mean, yeah, it does. It's like no frills. Does all the basics as you would want. Pretty reliable GPS, pretty reliable heart rate. Not infallible on both those counts for me when I tested it, but does enough. And there is enough in the package for that price. It's one of those, if you've got someone who's just starting out running, they're not going to be that disappointed if they opened this up, as a present. It would be, it will keep them going for that first sort of year, 18 months, 2 years of running, I think.
Yeah, it's a really solid watch. One that you'd probably be looking out for in the sales now if you are looking at buying a running watch for someone this Christmas, for example. And like I say, we call this beginner watches. A lot of these watches will appear in other videos in this series. They're all great watches for runners, full stop, but we do think they've got a bit more appeal to beginners, so we flagged them up here, and that is it. That is the first roundup of this series. Look out for the next one, which I think is going to be best value running watches. Nicely timed for the endless barrage of sales we're all suffering through right now. But yeah, that's goodbye from me.
Goodbye from me.
Didn't tell the guys going to do this, so they've panicked.